So these are really fun events for me because I see so many colleagues as well as former students and alumni. It's just wonderful to see folks. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Jan Greenberg. I'm the director of the School of Social Work. I'm honored that the Dean, Darrell Wheeler, accepted our invitation to speak at our annual Dorothy Pearson Lecture on Equity and Social Justice. Dr. Wheeler is nationally known for his research on HIV/AIDS and also his leadership roles, and he's the president of the National Association for Social Workers. This year, we're trying to do something different. This is about our 4th year that we've done this Dorothy Pearson Lecture on Equity and Social Justice. In light of what's happened at Ferguson and also more recently in our own backyards on Willie Street with the shooting death of Anthony Robertson, we thought we would do something different. And so after this lecture, we're going to have breakout sessions to discuss the role of social work in fighting injustices and racial injustice. These breakout sessions are going to be led by our first ever cohort of BSW 5 Alpha Honor Society students who helped organize today's event. And they're going to be co-led by some field instructors as well as our community partners. I just wanted to take a minute to introduce our 5 BSW Honors students and our co-leaders for their breakout groups. Our 5 students are Anna Baldwig, Allison Bender, Kim Heyman, Marissa Hajnowski, and Megan Osowski. This is our first cohort. I'd also just like to recognize the people who will co-lead the breakout discussion groups. Reverend Everett Mitchell, Amanda Angola, Mathani Amangi, Tracy Chopra, and Linda Parks. Thank you. So, following the lecture, we're going to bring out some food. We're hoping that you're going to grab some food. We're going to set up 5 different places in the auditorium with circles, and that you'll will at the very end we'll show you what those who will be participating in the breakout sessions have gone a color code, and we'll tell you where to go, what circle to go. I also just wanted to thank Mary Palaskis, wherever Mary is. She's an advisor for the school, and she's worked really closely with our BSW Honor Society to make today possible. And if it wasn't for Mary, today wouldn't have happened. So thank you so much, Mary. Today's lecture is made possible by Dr. Dorothy Pearson. I want to say a few words about Dr. Pearson. Dr. Pearson is a really important person to myself, and Dr. Wheeler is here because of the mentoring that Dr. Pearson provided him. Dorothy was born in Durban, Mississippi, a very small farming community. When she was the youngest of 9. When she was 8, the family moved to Bogalusa, Louisiana, a small paper mill town. Dorothy excelled in high school. Her parents were really supportive of her academic aspirations, and she went on to receive a bachelor's degree at Southern University in Baton Rouge in 1959. And she was about to enter graduate school in Atlanta University or Fisk University, and they were both in sociology. They were both segregated institutions, and Dorothy always had gone to school in segregated school systems. But 5 days after receiving her undergraduate degree, her brother lived here in Milwaukee, and she decided to take a vacation up to Milwaukee, where her brother lived. And I don't know if anybody's been in Bogalusa in the summertime, but she fell in love with Milwaukee and the cool breezes off the lake. So she decided to apply to the UW School of Social Work for her master's degree. Also, at that time, it was not only the cool breezes off the lake, it was also, at that time, the South was deeply segregated in the 1950s, and she wanted to know what was on the other side. She had done well in segregated school systems, and she wanted to see if she could make it in an integrated educational system. I'm just going to show a very short clip in which Dr. Pearson talks about her decision.
I was born and raised in the South, where segregation was the law of the land among the races, black and white. And as a result, I was educated in black institutions. I had excelled in those settings and was, kind of riding high. But it occurred to me, gee, there's a whole nother world over there. Maybe I don't really know anything. I don't know enough. Because the doors were so guarded on traditionally white institutions that I did not have the opportunity to attend. And I felt that I needed to sort of test myself and to see if all of this was real, Suppose they know a whole lot of stuff I've never heard of, and I'm not as with it as I had been thought to be in my community. So I said, gee, I got to go over there and see how I might do over there where I'm not permitted to go. I wanted to broaden my horizons. I was satisfied with my education. That was all I knew. But I said it must be something else. And no matter how self-confident you are that the laws of the land and how other people view you can have an impact. And I had support with family and community and so forth. But I knew in my heart of hearts that I wanted to see the broader world and to see how I fit and what my preparation was. And I'm happy to report to you that I was well prepared. That's the impact that society, with his segregation laws had on me, that I must step over the line and see what it is. And it was a bunch of foolishness as to why. There were more resources, of course, because of the discrimination. But if you can think and do critical thinking, once you get an opportunity, you're just like the other people who had it. And maybe more because you had to learn the rudiments of it without having the instrumentation. So I feel very fortunate I've been a part of both worlds.
I just wanted to share a little more about Dorothy's story. So at the time she came up here, she was 21 years old. She was the youngest of 9. Her father was a sharecropper. The idea of going to college was really foreign. She was the first in her high school. It was the first in her family of 9 to graduate high school. But she came up here, and at the time, at university, we had 2 campuses, one in Milwaukee and the other in Madison. And it was a summertime, and the deadline for admissions had far passed, and she was initially told that she would have to wait a year. But Dorothy is not somebody you tell to wait a year if she has her mind set on something. So she decided to make an appointment with the director of the school in Milwaukee. And he met with her, and he was so impressed with this woman's drive. They asked the admissions committee to make an exception, review her application, and see if she was qualified to get in. She was accepted into the program, and she was allowed to start in the fall. Now that she had to deal with the fact that she got into the school, but she had no way that she was going to be able to pay out-of-state tuition. So back then, the graduate school had these special scholarships that would waive out-of-state tuition. And it was offered to the most promising students. But the time that Dorothy was admitted, all of these scholarships had been allocated to other students. So again, Dorothy was not going to be deterred from from at least trying to get into the school at Wisconsin. So she made an appointment with the dean of the grad school. After meeting with Dorothy, he too was impressed with this woman, and he decided to grant her a tuition waiver. So now she got into the school, she had a tuition waiver, but she had no money to live on for day-to-day expenses. Also back then in the 1960s, this was the early 60s, these large agencies like Family Service used to have stipends for students, and some of us benefited from those stipends and wouldn't have otherwise been able to go to school. Dorothy decided to apply to a family agency in Milwaukee to do her first year internship. She was accepted, but the stipends had already been allocated and there was no money left. So you can guess what Dorothy did. She got on the phone, she called the executive director of this family service agency, and he agreed to meet with her. And he promised, he didn't have a stipend for the fall, but he promised if she entered the program and she stuck with it, she did well her first semester, he would find a stipend for her at the beginning of the second semester. So Dorothy went on, she eventually completed her MSW at the school. She worked for a couple years, and then she returned to the Ph.D. program in 1973 to get her Ph.D. She returned in the early 70s to get her Ph.D. She did graduate in 1973. She was the first African American to graduate from our program. With her Ph.D. in hand, she went on to joint appointment with the University of Miami School of Medicine and Barry University School of Social Work. In 1975, she took a position at Howard University as a professor, and she remained at Howard until 1999. She established the first PhD program in social work at Howard University, and she became its first director. Dorothy's been the recipient of many awards. In 1999, the National Association for Social Work bestowed on her the highest honor, the title of a social work pioneer. Dorothy is a highly motivated and energetic, passionate, determined person, incredibly bright. But the thing I feel probably most proud about, that her success is due to the fact that doors were open here at Wisconsin at a time when doors were being closed shut to African Americans around the country in terms of higher education. And the other thing I like about this is Dorothy had the courage, and it took incredible courage for somebody to walk through those doors, not knowing what was on the other side. I think we can all take great pride in Dorothy's success, and that our school had a small role to play in it. So with this background, I wanted to introduce our keynote speaker. It's a great privilege and honor that Dean Wheeler is speaking today. He's the president of the National Association of Social Workers, as I mentioned. He's also the dean of Loyola University School of Social Work. You can't imagine how incredibly busy he is, but he's making the time to come up here to speak in his busy schedule, so thank you so much. Dean Wheeler received his MSW at Howard University, where he was mentored by Dr. Pearson, and he received his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh. We also received a master's in public health. He went on to a position at Hunter College in New York City, where he rose to the ranks of the Associate Dean for Research from 2007 to 2011. He left Hunter in 2011 to become the dean at Loyola. Dr. Wheeler's pioneering research focuses on the identification and exploration of individual and communal resiliency in HIV prevention and intervention, with a particular emphasis on African American, gay, bisexual, and transgendered communities. He's the author or co-author of over 50 articles, book chapters, and monographs. His work has been funded by the American International Health Alliance, in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for which he received a 4-year grant of $1.7 million. Since joining NASW in 1986, he's been active at both the chapter and national levels. He's held many positions, including the National Board Vice President, the Chair of the National Health Section Committee, and Co-Chair of the National Committee on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgendered Issues. Dean Wheeler was elected to NASW presidency in 2014, and he's been honored by the profession by being named a social work pioneer. Please join me in welcoming Dean Wheeler, who will speak on social work, social justice, and social action.
Wow. I'll get it. Yeah. Good evening, University of Wisconsin. How are you? Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to pull up my presentation, and then I'm going to tell you a couple things about, there we are, about me that maybe we didn't cover already. Like, as a pioneer, it just means you're getting older, right? It's such a pleasure to be here. You saw in the video clip and you've heard I had the wonderful privilege of being supported, mentored, taught, led, drugged, kicked, never kicked, but wonderfully molded by Dr. Dorothy Pearson. She was my instructor and my graduate counselor. We had directors or counselors at that particular time at Howard University. And there are two things that, well, there are many things that we have in common, starting with the last being a social work pioneer. But Dorothy Pearson finished college the year that I was born, so it was 1959. I rarely tell my age. I usually fib and say I was only 3 when I started this process, but as you can tell by the math, I was actually 7. All right, there we go. You got it. So we were probably kindred spirits in some way. And so who would have known at the time of my birth, that I would be in the presence of what I considered iconic greatness when we sat in those classes together and had the opportunity to experience from Dr. Pearson when she talked about being the first African-American woman to get her Ph.D. here at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And to think that many years later, I'd be standing here with the privilege of giving a lecture that she named. As I prepared for this, I was in communication with Dr. Pearson and was actually going over thoughts about the lecture, and I was very fastidious on this and saying, I can't disappoint you. What am I going to do? When anyone who's ever had a mentor of that magnitude, it's more than humbling. It was like, okay, I won't be able to get a sentence out. So I regret that she can't be here, but I'm actually glad that she's not here. It would be even more difficult for me to move through the presentation. And as we were talking, that's when we came up with, she said, you've really framed this out with your content around the iceberg. And I want to just say a couple of things that she and I talked about before I get into the lecture. And I had wonderful lunch with our social work baccalaureate honor students, and I was writing when I was talking to Dr. Pearson, right? Here it is. And we talked about many things, but she really talked about the need for this lecture to emphasize the content on social justice, for it to be something that challenged our thinking about the way we approach the work that we do, and it needed to be grounded in social work practice, and really something that would go into perpetuity. So I really commend you for having this wonderful opportunity to celebrate someone I hold in such high esteem, and I'm sure you do as well. And with that said, I want to dive right into my presentation. I promise not to do an overkill with PowerPoint presentations. I have several slides, but hopefully they'll be as engaging as they are content deep. But I want us to move beyond just the I'm going to lecture at you because I'm not an expert on anybody in this room. As I tell individuals, it's a 24/7 job to take care of me, and there's no way in the world I can be an expert on anyone else. What I can do is offer any insights that I have along the way. And just one final disclosure about the commonalities we have with Dr. Pearson. When she talked about being, when you gave her history and talking about being the product of segregated Southern school systems, even though I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, given the time that I grew up, K through 12 was a segregated experience for me. The first time I ever sat in a classroom with a white person, I was in college. That's how the Chicago public school system were, and we're not that far from Chicago. So, and many of the issues that Chicago public school systems face are the same issues that you face here, and unfortunately, they're some of the same issues that we would have faced then, but I would say in many ways they're worse. Because there were some elements, and Dr. Pearson nailed it, there were some elements about the preparedness through a segregated system that well prepared me to be able to really take on interesting challenges. And as we'll talk about in our discussion and our time together, there are things as social workers that we need to pay attention to and understand from our historical perspective right to contemporary practices, to be able to extract from those the things that make sense today, jettison or discard the things that don't, but always have an eye towards what we can do better to achieve that social equity and that social justice that we talk about. I like to begin a bit with definitional statements, and we talk about the topic of tonight's discussion, social justice and social equity. So I think it's important to be on the common page with some terms. And I just want to highlight a couple of things here, and I know everyone can't read it, but I'll just read a couple things here. Social justice is a process, not a destination. It's really important to understand and for me to articulate that, because destinations are places that you arrive to and then you stop. Social justice clearly is not something as a place we arrive to because we thought we had achieved it at many moments in time. When we elected a non-white president, we had a race-neutral society and we had arrived. Lies. We thought we had achieved it in the 60s when African Americans achieved a certain set of civil rights. And what do we see now? We have constitutional mandates that are actually gerrymandering the whole political voting electorate by redesignating voting lines. So we achieved it. Not. We had equity between and amongst the genders when we had women's suffrage and women in the room. Everything's rosy, right? Why do we have income inequalities that are just astonishing in an industrialized society? We didn't get there. So one of the questions I even pose to us is social justice attainable? Is social justice the same as the absence of social inequalities or social injustice when we've lived in a society where we've never even seen what social justice and social equity truly looks like? This is not to point the finger at any one group or one groups of individuals, but it is to articulate very clearly that in the absence of a clearly defined social system where we have actually seen, experienced that utopic moment that we call social justice, we're talking about building something that has never existed, at least not in this social system. There have always been inequalities, and in fact, many of the social systems that we have today are predicated and demand that inequalities drive some of the very forces and systems that we have now relied on so heavily. You hear the political rhetoric and people say things like, I don't believe in federal government intervening, but don't mess with my Social Security. Things exactly. They're predicated on all kinds of myths that we hold about what truly is a socially just and socially equitable society. And so the diagram to the right of the screen my right, your left, is really about the difference between equality and equity. That equality actually shows that people would be compressed, and we actually have to get to equity where some people need a bump up to even get to the point where they would be able to achieve in a way that's meaningful or comparable to other groups. And so as a society, the question becomes, are we poised for social equity? I raise that as more of a Socratic kind of a question, and one for us to think about during the course of our time today, and maybe in the breakout groups and possibly in a question and response segment that we have tonight. But really, equity and equal opportunity, is something that we grapple with as terminologies, and it sounds wonderful rolling off of the lips, but the question is, what is it? And what would it look like if it were achieved? And what are the obstacles that keep us from getting there? So let's go to the profession. And because this is a social work program, and I'd like to spend some time doing that, so I want to talk a bit about the helping profession. And I want to reinforce this particularly for our students, because we talked about this at lunch when we talk about our helping profession. Social work, and our second bullet here, social work is a verb in this regard. It is both social and it is work. It is not something to be done in a passive process. You don't just think about social work. If you don't act on it, if you're not engaging in social systems, are you really doing that which is social work? Jane Addams would probably say no. The founding mothers of our profession would say no. Dr. Pearson would definitely say no. Does it mean that it comes without conceptual richness and depth and theoretical rigor? No, that's not what I'm saying. Does it mean that we act without knowing and having an intent and a direction? No, that's not what we're saying. But social work without social action, work is a core component of what we're talking about. When we talk about our profession, we often talk about our profession as a helping profession. There's two things I want to say about that before we get into the content-rich area on the various ways in which we do this. When we talk about social work being a helping profession, oftentimes it's characterized as helping other professions, and it's seen as that handmaiden profession. Well, here I'd like to say it's really quite actionable, and it's not about inertia again. It's not about not doing, and it is about mediating those systems that really keep people from reaching that social equity. It is the true interface between the individual and those social systems where we engage in the practice of the work, engaging and utilizing those social systems. And I guess that definition is as much for our non-social work friends as it is our social workers, but really to reinforce this. We do many things. We provide services, we refer, we develop, we coordinate, we assess, we research. Goodness knows, those of us in academia, we research, but once again, I say, if we're not connected to the practice and actually out doing the work, what kind of social work is that? I'm a nightmare of a dissertation committee person, because when I get your dissertation, the first thing I look to is how it relates to practice. If it doesn't relate to practice, I ask the question, why are you getting this degree in social work? Because if I can't see the social work there, then you've got a real issue with me. I don't care how rich the methodology is, a physician or epidemiologist would never have something not connected to that which they're doing. And so we have a responsibility there. And we're known by our actions. So as a profession, people understand us as a field based on, and I really, I'm going to draw, I wish I could have gotten this slide, and Mary shared it with me from your presentation that you had actually last week when you were doing the racial equity, you confronting racial injustice and social work beyond neutrality. And it was actually one of the last slides, and I got this at lunchtime, and so it was really quite compelling. And so I'll just read from it. It says, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those in times of great moral crisis who choose to do nothing. We are known as a profession by our actions. And so what we'll be talking about tonight, what I'll be emphasizing, is the actionable components of what we do. and combining that with a rigor of a commitment to this thing we call social justice, social equity, and resolving these disparities of our time. You know, we do this work in so many different ways. We do it in our aging, we do it in criminal justice, military and veterans, health inequalities and disparities, disaster planning and aftermath. This one is these two are actually taking up a lot of my thinking these days as we go into 21st century, true 21st century mode with all of the cyber attacks, disaster planning. It seems like every day we're almost on the brink of that next disaster, whether it's somebody flying over Capitol Hill in a one-person kind of device, which is an interesting thing because you can fly over Capitol Hill, land on Capitol Hill ground, and be gently escorted off the lawn. But if you're a black man selling Lucy's on Staten Island, you're chokehold and killed. We've got a paradox there. And the question comes up, how do we resolve this? And where are we in the actionable moments that speak to what we see in our time? So let's take a deeper look at the current state of social work and beyond the iceberg's tip. And what are contemporary perspectives? And the way that I want to do this, because I anticipated that there would be diverse audiences, I'd like to dissect this into many different professional realms that social workers engage in, and maybe even get you thinking about the places in which we do this work. So one of them is child welfare and children and family welfare. Social workers do work, and this one is first because this is actually one of those places of social equity and social justice, safeguarding children, that's fun, where we really have laid claim as a profession to being at the forefront. I mean, if there's any domain that is truly ours or was historically ours, it's probably child and family welfare. But what has happened over time? We've become so routinized, we've become so wedded to the social systems that what do people think about when they think of child welfare engagement? They actually think of social workers as you're the people who come and take children away. That's kind of the beginning and the end of where people see us in a field and in an area of practice that is so replete with opportunities for us to strengthen and reduce the inequalities that we see in family systems. It's not, we've come a ways from the 1960s of going in and being the social worker, looking in the cupboards of single mothers to see if there was a razor or any indication of a male potentially living in the house, right? I mean, we've come up, because first of all, we don't want to do the home visit. So we're not, I mean, that's one of the reasons we may not be there. But really, we've come to realize that maybe having a two-parent household may not be the worst thing in the space, but sometimes having a two-parent household requires that we engage in a therapeutic process to help people understand how to live in blended families, to learn how to bring children into the fold who may not be your biological children, but need the nurturance, care, and supervision of the newly introduced parent, whether that's a male or a female. We've learned that in our social system, and I looked at the statistics for here in Dane, we are in Dane County, right? In Dane County, that your situation is not that different than is mirrored in many non-rural spaces across the country, in urban spaces, where increasingly we see a gap between economically empowered households that are female-headed and those that are not. Households that are female-headed typically have, on par, less money available to them. They are very often non-white in urban environments because of high concentrations of non-white populations centered in urban environments. Not that there are not white women who are single parents, and there are many of them who are out there who are economically strapped and grappling with life circumstances. But what we see in a place like Madison, Wisconsin, or Milwaukee, or Chicago, is we see the gap and the differential actually crying for social workers to be engaged. And the question is, where are we? What are we doing? And if our services are so greatly needed and so useful, why aren't we seeing the compression of that gap and we're seeing the widening of that gap? And not only the widening of that gap, but the maintenance of that gap in such a way that it becomes almost predictable at birth what the consequences will be for individuals born into those households. So children and family welfare engaged on an individual level system where we do what we historically have called direct practice, but clinical work with individuals, children, and family is an important component. But if we don't attend to the meso and the political systems that undergird and finance these systems, we're missing something critical. If we think about another domain in which social work has historically and classically been engaged, it certainly is in mental, and we now have used the term increasingly, behavioral health. Focusing on the actions and not always on the structures of the brain or the mental functionings, but recognizing that these mental systems, the neuropsychological and the neurosciences affect behaviors, and it's actually the behaviors that society sees, and we're out there in the trenches and doing the work, engaged in behavioral work. Social workers in the United States are still the largest provider of behavioral and mental health services. However, the gaps that we see in the individuals who receive exemplary services and those who don't continue to grow. I could probably ask you in this room, if you're a healthcare provider involved in mental health or behavioral health, what's your caseload look like and how has it changed over recent times? It probably hasn't gotten better, it's probably gotten worse. Exactly. I could ask you, how many of you as students who are engaged in mental health or behavioral work get adequate supervision? And most of you should say yes because you're a student. But then when you're that neophyte worker in the mental health and behavioral system, your first job out, what happens when you get plunged in there and there's no supervision? What we're seeing here is a system where equity is almost not guaranteed. Social inequality becomes reinforced because the systems and structures that finance what we do in these systems actually are not geared to provide the service that we say that it's supposed to provide. So the question for us becomes, what are we doing, not just in terms of delivering the best evidence-based or the best evidence-informed practice, but what are we doing to combat the systems that actually support and retrench the kind of behavioral systems and behavioral delivery systems that are guaranteed to do just the opposite of what we say we want them to do? Because there's no way in the world you're going to get the outcome, garbage in produces garbage out. There's just no doubt about it. And so our mental and behavioral health systems, whether it's starting with the deinstitutionalization in the 80s, or we're looking at the de facto behavioral mental health systems today, which are called jails, which is where we warehouse individuals who sit with mental health systems, mental health conditions. Most statistics indicate that not less than 30% of all persons incarcerated today have an underlying or primary mental or behavioral health condition. And if you add substances to that, you're probably dealing with upwards of 50 to 60% of all people in incarcerated situations. So if we're not attending to the mental and behavioral health issues, what are we actually doing as a social system to produce the kind of equity that we say we want to achieve? Having the best evidence-based practice model doesn't necessarily work in a very complex and messy system in the real world. Income and economic well-being. When more than 10% of the US population is living in poverty, no matter where you are, this is national, at least 10% is living in poverty. And that doesn't necessarily count those of us who delude ourselves on a daily basis to think that we're not just because we have a paycheck today. Here today, gone tomorrow. How many of us are living that close to being insolvent should we lose the job that we hold today? In a system that produces economic and social insecurity, there is a fundamental and underlying flaw that says while we give lip service and rhetoric to a model of social justice and social equity, what are we truly doing? I recently had the opportunity to participate in a panel and with prior Congressman Ron Dellums, and he talks very eloquently about the debate that we have on Capitol Hill, and I invoke him now. What he talks about is why are we having a debate on a minimum wage? Because the debate should be on a livable wage. A debate that's predicated on a minimum wage suppresses the possibility, back to that picture of equity, that anyone will ever get beyond the point of just barely having enough to be poor. Why aren't we, as a social society, as a society that says we're a civil society, engaged in a debate about the livable wage? And where are we as social work professionals in that debate? Where are we in producing evidence that maybe compares societies that provides a livable wage to those who don't, or systems or circumstances that would promulgate a livable wage compared to just a minimum wage or poverty circumstances? The undergirding factors for so many of our social ills are right there embedded in an economic system that is predicated on the 1% owning what? 80% or more of the wealth in this country, held by, as I said, that 1%, while the rest of us are struggling and have our heads in our sand and our tails in the air, and we're going to get bumped in the end. There is no doubt we live in an odd system where we promote striving for the highest standards of economic and social inclusiveness, but we put in place systems that guarantee it will never happen. How many of you have clients, whether you're a social worker or not, who when you meet with them, one of the first things they say to you is, "I need money"? Dr. Pearson said, what? I need income to go to school. I need income to sustain myself. Romance with no finance is a nuisance. Let me just tell you. If you try to go to the movie theater after this event and go in with no ticket and no money and no popcorn, there's no romance at the end of the night because you're not getting into the movie theater. It's just not going to happen. So we have to be realistic about the fundamental reality that money is part of a capitalist society. And I say particularly to our academic leaders, how many of us do not promote and talk about economic sufficiency in our course and content work? How many students have I come into contact with and say, boy, we don't really talk about money? Whether it's money for ourselves in negotiating for our jobs or money about our clients and how to manage it. This is a fundamental reality when, in fact, as you see, we've got 10% of the US population living in poverty and 1% commanding such a disproportionate segment of the national wealth. An area that is really, really, really near and dear to my heart as someone who has a public health degree. Before going to social work school, I went to medical school. I actually did not like medical school. Sometimes I say I hated it. I won't go so far as to say I hated it, but medical school and I didn't get along. I realized after about 6 months there, Marcus Welby only existed on TV because I wanted to be Marcus Welby. Those of you who don't get it, ask somebody who's a little bit older later. They'll explain at the commercial break, okay? But it was really an experience that, was daunting for me, and I stumbled into this thing called social work. But I knew I wanted to be engaged in population-based activities, but also to impact the health and well-being of individuals. And I think that's why I actually do a lot of health and behavioral work and HIV-related work. But these two slides do a couple of things. One, it celebrates, bless you, celebrates what social work does in social care. And let me be very clear, there is no health care without attending to the social circumstances of the individual. Persons live in context, whether that is in a healthcare setting or in their own home setting. How many of you have been to a healthcare provider who says something and you kind of look at them and go, I can't incorporate that into my life? Because, you know, if you're a new mom or a new parent and they're like, well, get some rest. Okay, you're going to get rest with 3 kids. My sister and her partner, they've got 3 kids at home between soccer games and mitigating fights and whatever else they're doing. There's no rest for the weary. It's just not going to happen. And just taking care of yourself is getting that 5-minute reprieve when the kids are between activities. And it looks very different. And then the other thing I put out here is that the issues about individual health care and some of the stuff I mentioned earlier about behavioral health care are really important, but society is looking for large-scale impact and population-oriented outcomes. So the prospect for public and medical health social work engagement is still quite promising. This is not a commercial to become a public health social worker, but it is underscoring the fact that there are many disciplines recognizing what we've known for over 100 years as a social work profession, that it is about context and environment. There are increasing encroachments on our professional turf coming from many different disciplines who are saying, almost as an epiphany, man, the person's environment really affects what happens to their health. And I love coming up behind them to be able to say, knock, knock, social work knew that for a long time, and yes, I'm a social worker, and we're gonna help you understand this. But we, as a profession, have to understand and claim what is historically ours if we're going to reduce the inequalities that we see. This is an area for me, as I said, near and dear. In my own research and the work that we do in HIV and AIDS, if I might take just a moment to talk about that, we know that in the United States, there are probably 1.2 million individuals living with HIV in the United States, whether it's new infections or long-term survival. We know that 50,000 individuals become infected every year in the United States. It's kind of a steady state experience. However, in the United States, best medical care you can get anywhere on the planet, if you can afford it, in the United States, is that 20%, at least 20% of those individuals, those 1.2 million, don't know that they're HIV positive. And of the remaining 80%, go to the end of the story, not more than 18% of the remaining 80% are achieving optimal medical suppression of their HIV in an environment where medical optimization is readily available. So I spend a lot of my research time looking at the systems and structures that create those inequalities. And let me say they look pretty bleak if you are a non-white male. Let me back up. They look bleak if you're a gay man or a bisexual man in the United States, because that's the population that's driving the epidemic. And they look even worse if you're an African American male. And they look even worse if you're between 13 and 24. In the United States, that's where the epidemic is entrenched. And so when we talk about some of the things we're going to talk about in just a moment, think about the 13 to 24 age group of African American men. Oh, you recently had a situation with someone who is in that age demographic, didn't you? When we talk about the criminal justice system and human rights, the picture is relatively bleak on so many different fronts for young men across the country when we look at the income inequalities, when we look at poor housing opportunities, when we look at social instabilities, but then when we look at the criminal justice system and the human rights situation in the United States, and you're a young man in that population group, and you're living in the United States of incarceration, where we have the highest per capita incarceration of individuals of any of the industrialized countries. Why is this? In certain places, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happens here, I don't know this for a fact, but having lived 16 years in New York, I know that in New York City, there are some actuarial processes that build future beds in Rikers Island and upstate prisons predicated on the zip code birth of a cohort. So they'll look at how many African Americans are born today and calculate how many prison beds are going to need in 15 years. That's exactly what they're doing, because they know the pipeline is there. They know the economic inequalities are there, the structural realities are there. They know, and if you look at a map, it's quite unfortunate. And your statistics show this as well. I was, again, looking at the statistics from your conference last week. Wisconsin, Illinois, New York, we all have the same problem. We live in environments where, unfortunately, 50% of the African American young men who enter high school will not graduate. 50%. What does that foretell for an incarceration and a human rights experience? Let's not forget that the United States has not signed on to the Human Rights Declaration. And why is it that we as a society that says, oh, we can shoot someone in their back, and then on the media you see that person go, but that doesn't happen in the United States. That doesn't happen in Dane County. That doesn't happen in my state. Well, where in the hell did it happen if it didn't happen in your backyard? It wasn't a clip from a TV show from another planet or another country. It was right here. So the question becomes, where are we in this political and social time of great need for what social work says it has to offer? When we have the Tony Robinsons, the Michael Browns, the Kamani Grays, the Kendrick McDays, the Trayvon Martins, where is our profession? Where are we as individual social workers? A moment of historical lesson, and why I really talk about this as being the tip of the iceberg. I'm not one who's really going to go out and do a rally or a march for any one of these individuals. I'll be very clear on that, and let me tell you why. Because this is, as I say, the tip of the iceberg. And because every week we hear about another one of these situations occurring. And if the most we can muster is a rally for the individual and say, I'm marching for Trayvon. No, you're not. Trayvon's dead. It's an unfortunate reality. No, you're not. You're marching to absolve your guilt from having not done something or being engaged at a deeper level, and particularly if you're a professional social worker. When we look at Ferguson, and we saw the powder keg of Ferguson, how many people have heard of Pierce City, Missouri, and the historical events that occurred there a little more than 100 years ago? Hands up. I know 5 people have heard of it. Pierce City, and you can look this up and you check, do fact checking. Pierce City, but don't look it up until we're finished with my discussion. Pierce City, Missouri, not that far from Ferguson, early 1900s, an African-American prominent community that coexisted tenuously with a white community in a really segregated part of Missouri. But there was an incident, much like we've seen in many of the Jim Crow experiences, where when something happened to a white individual, all attention was focused on the black community immediately. So it resulted in not just a lynching of an individual, but in Pierce City, what they did was, in the middle of the night, took the black homeowners out of their homes, men, women, and children, marched them down Main Street, and opened fire on them. The individuals who were not immediately killed had to flee with only the things they had on their backs. And then, let's fast forward now to 2015, some of the ancestors have come back And they've actually dug into some of the cemeteries and done the anatomical test to confirm that those are the ancestors. And so they've come back and said, well, if these towns were owned by black folk, where are the deeds that now were transferred to the white community that are living there? And so the white community has said, well, there's no way for us to know, and who would really have paid attention to that, so we own it now. You talk about reparations, you're talking about upset people living in Pierce City, so something like a Ferguson incident, a Mike Brown, we're just seeing a powder keg waiting to happen. And that's one example. How many people, I know, probably more people know about this, where was Black Wall Street? In Oklahoma, right? If you haven't heard about the Black Wall Street, it was in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City was the place didn't we just have an incident in Oklahoma? Yeah, exactly. Historical legacy upon historical legacy begets what? If we're not taking care of everything underneath the iceberg, attending to the tip of the iceberg really doesn't get us anywhere. But just as I finish that train of thought, the Black Wall Street was in Oklahoma, one of the few places that in the Depression was thriving. It did economically well. And clearly, when the rest of the environment was going downhill, people were looking and saying, why is this going well? Well, it was a fundamental result of segregation that resulted in that because black folks couldn't bank anywhere else. We didn't allow black folks to invest in some of the mainstream systems, so when the mainstream systems failed, their money was protected because it wasn't part of what could have been impacted by the Depression. So economic forces would tell us, of course, they're going to be isolated. So what was the social response to that? They razed Oklahoma City. They bombed it from the air and took it off the map. The same thing happened to Rosewood, Florida. Fact check on any of those. When we live in a society where we have human rights violations of this nature, is there any wonder there's a legacy of frustration amongst a group of young men who are economically, socially, and politically isolated in such a way that we don't do anything for them as a social system? So it's not just about my hands are up, or I'm here for Trayvon. It's, are we attending to the historical underpinnings that we need to know about that get us to where we are today? Aging is a place that, we're aging. We're aging as they're sitting here listening to me talk. We're aging as a social system. And aging is another place where social work finds itself in great need. Helping people to advance across a continuum. I like to say, and maybe it's a function of me getting older, there's too much attention to youth. There's just too much attention given to youth because the reality is getting you to adulthood and beyond. That's where you're only under 18 for a short period in your life, and if you live long enough, you're going to be over 18 longer. So the emphasis should be on people 50, 55 and up now. That's the new number. That's the one I claim. Exactly. But the reality is, if we're not attending to the nuanced and special circumstances of individuals about aging healthily, we're going to end up in a really bad situation, and we see it in the disparate outcomes when we look at the infirmity that we see in certain groups who have poor nutritional outcomes, poor housing, all of the other things that we talked about before that predict how you're going to end up in terms of your aging experience. All of these really speak to a few things, our structural and social determinants of health and human services. Where are we in terms of developing our activities around things like early childhood development, education, employment, income, and job security, food security? While I didn't put it up there, Chicago is one of those places, and I can imagine it is here, where we have food deserts. There's no grocery store and no place to get any real food. You have to buy synthetic, canned, or I won't do a brand name, You have to buy prepared food that probably doesn't hold the same nutritional value for you. And that has a negative impact in the long term on your body and how your body metabolizes, and then what happens to the relationship between the body and the mind, and the implications that we see all over. Are we attending to this, and where are we as social workers? Housing, social exclusion, and stigma, all of these factors come to play. Now, I'm nearing the end of the discussion, a few more slides and discussion points, and I don't want to leave on a negative, so I want to say that the future is promising, but it's only the tip of the iceberg if we only focus on the tip of the iceberg. If we don't pay attention to the forces that lead to the historical realities that bring us to the circumstances in any of those areas that I identified, what are we truly doing as a professional body? What are we doing when we hold events that then we leave and say, oh, I feel really great, I got out there. I think about this as, I don't know how many people read this month's NASW news. We have to do these things, and I kind of shared things about myself. Watching television growing up in the 1960s, I think I was traumatized. Whenever something came on TV and it said a special report, by the time I was 10, I thought that meant somebody was dying. Because after watching J.F. Kennedy's funeral, Martin Luther King's funeral, Robert Kennedy's funeral, every time something came on the news, and I remember standing by those big black and white televisions, and I remember my parents actually sitting up at night, and I didn't know why they were sitting up at night in the 60s, but it was a tumultuous time in Chicago in the 60s, in 1968 and 69. It was for the safety of the family that they were doing that. These are the things that we have to pay attention to that shape who we are, and it's probably why I'm a bit radical about these things, but I think we've not allowed the history of these things to come forward. That we have allowed, in many instances, our desire for social justice to overshadow a clear articulation of the historical roots, the deep part of the iceberg that needs to be told. Because if we don't tell that component of the story, we miss something very powerful. Look what happened to a ship going up, the Titanic is where I'm going, if you don't pay attention to what's underneath. So as we conclude, we have to, as social workers, pay attention to all levels of our professional practice. Macro, meso, typo, macro, not macar, macro, micro, and meso. We have to really pay attention to the political and economic policies and trends of our days, whether that's religious and human rights, biological or technological, immigration and other forms of cultural reforms. We really need to be engaged if we're going to do this work in attending to our state and legislative annual federal budget initiatives, because again, as I jokingly said about the relationship between romance and finance, where the money goes, as Terry Mizrahi might say, is, how you use your budget is truly the most important thing. Where that money actually ends up speaks volumes to what your true agenda is. All of the lip service we give to the wonderful stuff that doesn't have any support economically doesn't produce the outcomes that we would hope to achieve. We have to attend to diverse clients, diverse workload compositions, and more flexibilities in roles. So your meeting last week on diversity is really important. And one of the things I say about diversity is, much akin to what I said at the beginning of this presentation, is it's a 24/7 job to take care of me. And the real work of diversity work is about getting your stuff in order. It's not about learning the 5 things I need to know to work with Latino communities or Asian communities or migrant, Bahrainians or that other group. That's not what it's about. The real work in diversity work is understanding, what does diversity mean to you? How are you sitting in positions of privilege and power? And I sit in positions of privilege and power, and I won't deny that. How do I understand the concepts of privilege and power manifest in my own life? If, as a male, Men in social work rise to academic leadership more rapidly than women in social work, and it's a female-dominated profession. Why is that? And I have to be very careful about the utilization of my voice when I'm in spaces where I am a guest in a female-dominated profession to make sure I shut up and listen to the voices of the true rank and file of our profession, who actually gave birth to this profession in a meaningful way that I reap the privilege of because I was born a male in this gendered society. So it's really important for us to think about the work that we do from that perspective. We as a profession must attend to the person and environment, the case to cause, the systems-oriented practice. We can't blame the victim as we so often do, and we slide into this very rapidly. Give you a prime example. I think we do a very interesting job of victim blaming in our contemporary issues. How many people have seen the clips on news lately of since we talked about it, the black man being shot in the back, being chased? Those loops going over and over and over have an interesting way. The subtext is that the police are wrong, but what they actually show is the victim. Most of the video is focused on the victim. And so we end up making mental images in our mind about the victim as much as we do about the perpetrator. And we tacitly reinforce the victim blaming. And we were talking about this at lunch. One of the things that we learned after September 11th is that youth who were able to see repeated clips on the news of the planes hitting those towers were traumatized and had fears. So what are the implications of constantly showing those same kind of clips to young men 13 to 24 who look like those guys? It has to be, by extension, some of the same traumatization and victim blaming. And we need to be careful about that. And we need to write our media folks and say, are you attending to the parallel structures that we know impacted other groups, that you're reinforcing something you may not intend to, but you may need to pay attention to? We have to listen to indigenous knowledge. As social workers, I think sometimes we've gotten into a space where we stop listening to the true experts, and those are the people who have to live in the circumstances in which they live. You need to, as part of your cultural awareness, my cultural awareness, ask somebody, what is it like to be in your shoes? At the end of the day, as I said, we're known by our actions, but it comes down to three simple things. What do? Why do we do it? And what difference does it make? The what do we do are truly the skills and practices and tools and processes that we bring to the efforts that we hope to achieve. And are we truly articulating those well, kind of like the metaphorical stethoscope? Do we have the tools really well articulated? The why do we do it is the conceptualization, constructs, and theories. Are we paying attention to the historical antecedents and the concepts and the theories that lead us to make decisions? And are we being critical about those processes? And are we absolutely committed to following the trail that takes us often to places we don't want to go, in answering the question, what difference does it make given what I've done? And so I leave you with that, and it says in that slide, do you remember when all we had to worry about was client care? Well, in a highly competitive environment that we find ourselves today, with the kinds of social injustices and inequalities that we have today, it's not okay to sit quietly in your office and take care of the one client only and not pay attention to the bigger perspective. I don't think that's what the founding mothers did in the settlement house movements. I don't believe that, and I think they were very clear about that, and I don't think it's the way we should be going today. So with that, I really say thank you for inviting me, and the future of the profession is in our hands, and the time that you're going to spend either querying me of questions or playing the video I didn't get to see, or in the breakout groups. And I'm more than willing to stick around and respond to questions. And thank you very much.